A liberal professor challenged a royal guard to an IQ test, certain he'd embarrass him and prove he was just a mindless soldier. But the guard's response to a single question turned everything on its head, leaving the entire classroom in shock, and the professor completely humbled. Here's how it all unfolded. Before we reveal the full story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. And don't miss tomorrow's story, another unforgettable moment from the Royal Guards. The crisp October air at Oxford University carried the scent of fallen leaves as Professor Richard Langley entered his political philosophy classroom that morning, completely unaware that his carefully constructed academic superiority was about to crumble. Langley, a distinguished-looking man in his mid-50s with graying temples and wire-rimmed glasses, had built his reputation on dismantling what he viewed as outdated social institutions. His lecture schedule for the day read military ceremonies, patriotic pride, or institutional oppression, a topic that always generated heated discussion among his undergraduate students. The classroom buzzed with typical pre-lecture energy as students settled into their seats, notebooks open and phones discreetly positioned for note-taking. But the usual atmosphere shifted dramatically when every head in the room turned toward the back row. There, sitting with supernatural stillness, was a figure that seemed to have stepped out of a tourist postcard. Lieutenant Eldon Marchmont, of Her Majesty's Queen's Guard, resplendent in his iconic red tunic, black trousers with their characteristic red stripe, and pristine white gloves. His bearskin hat rested beside him on the desk like a sleeping animal. Langley's eyes immediately locked onto this unexpected visitor, and a predatory smile spread across his face. In 27 years of teaching, he had criticized military traditions countless times from behind his podium, but never had he been presented with an actual representative of the institution he loved to mock. The irony was delicious. Here was a living, breathing example of what he considered Britain's most absurd anachronism. Sitting in his very own classroom, the professor's pulse quickened with anticipation. This was going to be even better than his usual lectures. "Ladies and gentlemen," Langley announced with theatrical flourish, gesturing grandly toward the motionless figure in scarlet. "It seems fate has provided us with a living specimen to examine today." His voice carried that particular tone of academic condescension that his students knew well, the sound of a man who believed his education made him superior to everyone else in the room. The undergraduates exchanged nervous glances. They were accustomed to their professor's controversial statements and provocative teaching methods. But something felt different about this moment. The guardsman's presence seemed to alter the very air in the room, as if discipline itself had taken human form and was silently observing their academic discourse. "Tell us, Lieutenant," Langley continued, savoring each word, "what brings a member of Britain's most ornamental military unit to our humble discussion of intellectual inquiry? Are you here to defend the practice of grown men playing elaborate games of dress-up for camera-wielding tourists?" Several students giggled uncomfortably, but most remained silent, sensing the dangerous undercurrent in their professor's words. Marchmont sat perfectly still, his gray eyes tracking Langley's movement with the patient focus of a predator watching prey. Not a single muscle in his face twitched, not even when Langley's mockery grew more pointed. Langley interpreted this silence as exactly what he expected: intellectual paralysis in the face of academic challenge. In his experience, military personnel were all ceremony and no substance, men who had chosen physical conformity over mental development. "I imagine years of mindless marching doesn't leave much capacity for complex thought," he mused aloud, turning back toward his presentation screen with obvious satisfaction. But if Professor Langley had possessed even basic curiosity about the man he was so eager to humiliate, he might have noticed telling details that contradicted his assumptions. Marchmont's hands, despite their immaculate white gloves, bore subtle signs of a life lived beyond ceremonial duties. The ring and middle fingers of his left hand were slightly shorter than they should have been, souvenirs from an improvised explosive device in Afghanistan that had taken the fingertips but left the man's precision intact. As Langley launched into his prepared remarks about the intellectual bankruptcy of military pageantry, his language became increasingly personal and cutting. He spoke eloquently about cognitive suppression, about intelligent young men reduced to human mannequins, about the fundamental contradiction between military discipline and independent thinking. Each phrase was crafted for maximum impact, each pause calculated to allow his words to sink in. The students found themselves glancing back and forth between their animated professor and the silent figure in the rear of the classroom, like spectators at a peculiar sporting match where only one participant seemed to be playing. Some of the students, particularly those with family members in the armed forces, began shifting uncomfortably as their professor's critique grew more personal. The entire concept of ceremonial guards, Langley declared, his voice rising with passionate conviction, embodies everything problematic about Britain's inability to evolve beyond feudal fantasy. These individuals, and it's noteworthy that they're overwhelmingly male, are conditioned from youth to suppress individual creativity in favor of collective conformity. They're essentially human decorations, visually impressive but intellectually equivalent to the historic buildings they protect. It was at this moment that Emma Richardson, a thoughtful second-year student whose father served as a career Navy officer, tentatively raised her hand. "Professor Langley, isn't that characterization somewhat unfair? Don't the requirements for Queen's Guard service include significant educational standards?" Langley's laughter was sharp and dismissive, echoing off the classroom walls. "My dear Emma, the selection criteria for ceremonial positions prioritize physical attributes, height, bearing, and the capacity to follow instructions without deviation. It's essentially a beauty contest for men who photograph well in historical costume. Intelligence isn't merely unnecessary for such roles, it's actively counterproductive. After all, thinking soldiers might begin questioning the logic of their orders." The professor pivoted dramatically to face Marchmont directly, his confidence swelling with each unchallenged assertion. "Please, Lieutenant, correct me if my assessment is inaccurate. Enlighten us about the profound intellectual challenges involved in standing motionless for extended periods while tourists take photographs." For the first time since entering the classroom, Marchmont moved. The change was barely perceptible, a slight adjustment of his already perfect posture, but it was enough to make every person in the room unconsciously hold their breath. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a quiet authority that seemed to emanate from somewhere deeper than mere vocal cords. "Professor Langley," he said, and those two words somehow filled the entire space with their measured weight. "Your characterization suggests a fundamental misunderstanding of both military service and intellectual capacity. Perhaps we might examine your hypothesis through empirical methodology?" Langley blinked in surprise, clearly unprepared for such an articulate response. "Examine it? Through what means? You've asserted that military conditioning produces intellectual deficiency," Marchmont continued, his tone remaining perfectly level and professional. "I suggest we subject that assertion to the same standard of evidence you would apply to any other academic hypothesis. You have access to standardized cognitive assessments, do you not?" The professor's eyes narrowed, but his academic ego was already engaged. The challenge was too tempting to resist, particularly in front of a classroom full of students who treated his every word as gospel. "Are you proposing an intelligence test, Lieutenant? I'm suggesting you apply identical standards of evidence to your theories that you would demand from any other scholarly proposition," Marchmont replied calmly. "Unless, naturally, you prefer to base your conclusions on assumption rather than empirical data." The subtle implication contained in those words, that Langley might be intellectually dishonest, struck precisely the right nerve. The professor's face flushed slightly, but his smile broadened with anticipation. This was perfect. Not only would he demonstrate this arrogant soldier's intellectual limitations in front of his students, but he would do so using objective, measurable proof of military cognitive inferiority. "Excellent," Langley announced, his voice rising with theatrical enthusiasm. "Class, we're about to conduct a real-time experiment in cognitive evaluation. Lieutenant Marchmont has graciously volunteered to demonstrate the intellectual constraints imposed by military conditioning." Professor Langley strode purposefully to his adjacent office and returned carrying a substantial booklet, the Stanford Binet Intelligence Scale, one of the most rigorous cognitive assessments available to academic institutions. This particular test was designed for advanced evaluation, the type employed for graduate program admission and psychological research. Langley had administered it previously to assess doctoral candidates, and he was well aware of its reputation for being exceptionally challenging. "This represents a standardized cognitive assessment," Langley explained to his captivated audience as he placed the booklet on Marchmont's desk. "With deliberate force, it evaluates multiple dimensions of intelligence, logical reasoning capabilities, spatial perception, pattern recognition, mathematical computation, and abstract conceptual thinking. The typical university undergraduate achieves a score around 115. Graduate students generally range between 120 and 130. He paused for dramatic effect, maintaining direct eye contact with Marchmont. Military personnel, based on my extensive research, rarely exceed 100, and that assessment is quite generous. The students shifted uneasily in their seats. Even those who typically enjoyed their professor's confrontational teaching style were beginning to sense that this had crossed the boundary from academic inquiry into personal cruelty. But Marchmont appeared completely unperturbed. He lifted the booklet with the same careful precision he might have used to handle his ceremonial sword, opened it to the first page, and began reading the instructions with methodical attention to detail. "The time limit is 90 minutes, Langley announced, consulting his watch with obvious satisfaction. "I'll evaluate the results immediately upon completion, and we can analyze the findings as part of today's discussion on the relationship between institutional conditioning and cognitive flexibility." What Professor Langley could not have known, what he had never bothered to investigate about the man he was so eager to humiliate, was that Lieutenant Eldon Marchmont had graduated from the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst with highest honors, earning a double first in military engineering and international relations. He was fluent in 5 languages, held multiple advanced technical certifications, and had completed specialized training programs in explosive ordnance disposal, battlefield medicine, and tactical communications systems. More significantly, Marchmont had spent the previous 8 years making life-or-death decisions in combat environments, where incorrect judgments resulted in casualties, not just theoretical failure, but actual human death. As Marchmont began working through the assessment, an unusual transformation occurred within the lecture hall. The typical background noise of shuffling papers and whispered conversations vanished entirely. Students found themselves observing the guardsman's progress with inexplicable fascination. His pencil moved across the pages with mechanical precision, pausing only briefly as he considered more complex challenges. Langley attempted to continue his lecture, as if nothing extraordinary were happening, but his attention kept drifting back to the figure in red. He began experiencing the initial stirrings of unease as he observed Marchmont's steady advancement through the test. The guardsman wasn't struggling or displaying signs of confusion or frustration. Instead, he approached the assessment with the same methodical efficiency he brought to every aspect of his professional duties. The initial section addresses fundamental logical reasoning, Langley explained to his class, attempting to maintain his professional composure while stealing glances at Marchmont's work. Basic pattern recognition, elementary mathematical sequences. Even individuals with limited educational background should manage these preliminary problems without difficulty. But, as the professor moved closer to observe, he witnessed something that caused his confident expression to falter. Marchmont wasn't merely answering the questions, he was solving them rapidly, without hesitation, and his responses demonstrated a level of mathematical sophistication that Langley hadn't anticipated. The spatial reasoning section followed, featuring complex 3-dimensional puzzles that required test takers to mentally manipulate objects and predict their appearance from various angles. These problems typically challenged even brilliant students, demanding a combination of visual intelligence and abstract thinking that was genuinely uncommon. Marchmont approached these challenges with identical steady confidence, his pencil moving in quick, decisive strokes. But what captured Langley's attention wasn't simply the speed, it was the methodology. Where most individuals would work through spatial problems incrementally, Marchmont seemed to visualize complete solutions instantaneously, as if he were examining actual 3-dimensional objects, rather than 2-dimensional representations on paper. By the time Marchmont reached the advanced logical reasoning section, a small group of students had begun gathering around his desk, openly observing his work. These were problems that graduate students frequently found challenging, complex, logical chains involving multiple variables and conditional statements, the type of abstract thinking that supposedly required years of academic training to master effectively. Langley watched with mounting concern as Marchmont tackled a particularly difficult problem involving resource allocation under multiple constraints. It was the kind of question that demanded not just logical thinking, but creative problem solving, the ability to discover elegant solutions to complex challenges within strict parameters. But Marchmont's approach differed from anything Langley had witnessed in his quarter-century of academic experience. The guardsman didn't work through the problem sequentially, testing each possibility in order. Instead, He seemed to perceive patterns that weren't immediately obvious, finding connections between seemingly unrelated elements and constructing solutions that were both mathematically sound and unexpectedly efficient. That approach, that's not the standard methodology, Langley muttered, leaning over Marchmont's shoulder to examine his work more closely. No, sir, Marchmont replied without lifting his eyes from the test. It's superior. The quiet confidence contained in those 3 words sent an involuntary chill down Langley's spine. This wasn't the response of someone struggling with unfamiliar concepts. This was the response of someone who understood the material so thoroughly that he could see beyond the intended solution to something more elegant and effective. As if to demonstrate his point, Marchmont's subsequent solution employed principles of game theory to resolve a resource distribution problem in half the steps that the standard approach would require. His answer wasn't merely correct, it was brilliant, demonstrating a level of mathematical sophistication that belonged in an advanced graduate economics seminar, not an undergraduate intelligence assessment. The final section of the test was legendary among academic circles for its extraordinary difficulty. It contained what psychologists termed impossible problems, questions designed not necessarily to be solved, but to evaluate how individuals approached genuinely novel challenges. The most notorious was the triple matrix problem, a complex logical puzzle that had no standard solution, and was included primarily to observe problem-solving methodology under extreme pressure. Langley had administered this test dozens of times throughout his career, and he had never witnessed anyone complete the final section successfully. Even the most brilliant graduate students typically exhausted their time limit, or became frustrated with the seemingly unsolvable puzzles. It was designed to be a humbling experience, a reminder that even the most intelligent individuals had cognitive limitations. But as Marchmont reached the final problems, he displayed none of the usual signs of frustration or confusion. Instead, he paused for the first time since beginning the assessment, his gray eyes studying the triple matrix problem with the same intensity he might have brought to analyzing enemy positions through a sniper scope. The students had fallen completely silent now, sensing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Even Langley found himself holding his breath, waiting to observe how this supposedly limited soldier would handle genuine intellectual challenge. Then Marchmont did something that no one in the room could have predicted. Instead of attempting to solve the problem as presented, he began folding the paper, not randomly, not in frustration, but with the precise, deliberate movements of someone executing a carefully planned strategy. Within 60 seconds, the test page had been transformed into an intricate origami structure, a perfect miniature replica of a military surveillance drone. The symbolism was unmistakable and profound. Marchmont had taken an impossible problem and literally reshaped it into something functional, something practical, something that represented real-world application rather than abstract theoretical exercise. The lecture hall erupted in spontaneous applause, but Marchmont seemed completely unaware of the reaction. He placed the origami drone on his desk with the same careful precision he applied to everything else, then looked up at Langley for the first time since beginning the test. Your assessment operates on the assumption that all problems have textbook solutions, Professor, he said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the now silent hall. In reality, we frequently must create entirely new answers to unprecedented challenges. Langley stared at the paper drone, his mind racing to process what had just occurred. This wasn't simply an impressive display of manual dexterity, it was a profound statement about the fundamental nature of intelligence itself. Marchmont had demonstrated that true intellectual capability wasn't merely about following prescribed methodologies, but about the ability to reconceptualize problems entirely when traditional approaches proved inadequate. But this isn't how the assessment functions, Langley stammered, his usual eloquence abandoning him. You can't simply alter the parameters, can't I? Marchmont replied, and for the first time, there was the slightest hint of amusement in his voice. Professor, with respect, your entire lecture has focused on the supposed intellectual limitations of military personnel, but you've based that conclusion on a fundamental misunderstanding of what military intelligence actually entails. The guardsman rose slowly, his movements as precise and controlled as everything else about his demeanor. You speak of creative thinking as if it were the exclusive province of academia, but every single day, soldiers in combat zones face problems that have no predetermined solutions. Every tactical decision, every strategic choice, every split second Judgment call requires the kind of adaptive thinking that your test attempts to measure. Langley felt his carefully constructed worldview beginning to crumble as Marchmont continued, his voice never rising above conversational level, but somehow commanding the absolute attention of everyone present. The origami drone isn't merely a creative solution to your impossible problem, Marchmont explained with quiet authority. It's based on actual battlefield innovations I developed during my deployment in Afghanistan. When conventional supply routes were compromised by enemy action, my unit employed modified paper aircraft to deliver critical intelligence between forward positions. The students were hanging on every word now, their perception of both their professor and his challenger undergoing a fundamental transformation. This wasn't the mindless automaton that Langley had described. This was someone who had confronted real challenges in life and death situations and discovered solutions that existed nowhere in any academic textbook. The distinction between academic intelligence and operational intelligence, Marchmont continued, isn't that one form is superior to the other. It's that one is evaluated in theoretical environments, while the other is proven under conditions where failure has permanent, irreversible consequences. He picked up the origami drone, holding it delicately in his scarred fingers. You inquired earlier about the intellectual demands of ceremonial guard duty, Professor. Every moment of ceremonial service requires the same mental discipline that kept me alive in Helmand Province. Situational awareness, threat assessment, pattern recognition, instantaneous decision-making, all while maintaining perfect composure under constant observation. Langley attempted to rally his academic authority. But surely you cannot compare military training to genuine intellectual development. The kind of critical thinking we cultivate here at Oxford is excellent preparation for academic careers. Marchmont interrupted gently but firmly. But Professor, when did you last confront a problem where the incorrect answer could result in someone's death? The question hung in the air like smoke from a distant battlefield. In that moment, the entire dynamic of the classroom shifted irrevocably. Students who had spent months listening to their professor dismiss military service as intellectually inferior suddenly saw the situation from a completely different perspective. Emma Richardson, the student whose earlier question had initiated this entire confrontation, raised her hand again. Lieutenant, could you tell us about your educational background? I mean, your formal education before military service. Marchmont glanced at Langley, who nodded stiffly, his face having taken on the color of old parchment. I graduated from the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst with highest honors, Marchmont said simply. Double first in military engineering and international relations. Before that, I read mathematics at Cambridge University. I hold advanced certifications in explosive ordnance disposal, battlefield medicine, tactical communications, and psychological operations. I'm fluent in English, French, German, and Pashto, with conversational ability in Arabic and Mandarin Chinese. The silence that followed was profound and complete. Langley felt as if the ground had opened beneath his feet. This wasn't simply an intelligent soldier. This was someone whose academic credentials matched or exceeded those of most university faculty, combined with practical experience that no ivory tower academic could claim to possess. The Queen's Guard, Marchmont continued, isn't selected based on appearance alone, Professor. Every member holds at minimum a bachelor's degree from a recognized institution. Most possess advanced degrees. All have completed specialized training programs that would challenge any traditional academic curriculum. We're not toy soldiers or human robots. We're highly educated professionals who have chosen to serve our country in a visible, ceremonial capacity while maintaining readiness for operational deployment at any moment. He placed the origami drone on Langley's lectern with ceremonial precision. Your test was genuinely excellent. By the way, it's been quite some time since I've had the opportunity to work through problems of that complexity. Thank you for the intellectual exercise. And with that, Lieutenant Eldon Marchmont of Her Majesty's Queen's Guard collected his bearskin hat, executed a perfect about-face, and walked out of the lecture hall with the same silent dignity with which he had entered, leaving behind a room full of students who would never again assume that intelligence and military service were mutually exclusive concepts. Professor Richard Langley stood alone at his lectern, staring at the paper drone and wondering how many other assumptions in his carefully constructed worldview might be equally incorrect.